Welcome back to my channel, and today this is the introduction. This is part one to a two-part vlog series, and what this vlog series is all about is that I will be bringing you into the process of how I put together a sketchbook. Well, not exactly a sketchbook because I've showed you that process before, but it's basically how I do a drawing or art challenge, and because it's actually a very special process and it's actually a very lengthy process. And when I do these art challenges, especially these month-long challenges, what I normally do is I normally prepare a sketchbook for them. And before I prepare the sketchbook, even before I get to that preparation of sketchbook phase, there is an additional phase, an introductory phase that I go through. And that's what I want to bring to you in this vlog series. Now this is going to be two parts. I'm going to show you first the initial stage of how I get into it, and then I'm going to show you how I prepare that sketchbook. I may use the third part to either do it as a vlog vlog session, or I may use it as an art session, because in the third part is where I actually get into the actual drawing and rendering of those illustrations. Okay, so come along with me and let's start part one of this vlog series. Okay, so I was browsing, I think it was Pinterest, and I got into these pictures where I see they were asking to get to know your OCs. Now I have two OCs. I have September and October. And these OCs, I wanted to know more about them. I wanted to basically flesh them out, because so far all I've had about them is their pictures. And I did a coloring book. I did two coloring books, one with September, which is available on my Patreon, and the other with October. And I did put elements of what I want them to be in that coloring book, the process, but I've never really fleshed them out. I've never really talked about their dislikes, their likes. I've never really seen them as babies, as teenagers, as elderlies. I've never really, get to know their families or the communities that they come from. So I really want to get to know them. So I decided to do a art challenge where I get to know my OC, and the OC that I choose to use is my very first OC, which is September. But now that I have chosen the challenge I want to do, now I'm going to go into step one of how I get to prepare for that challenge. Now the first thing I get to do is to select my surface. It's kind of tricky when it comes to selecting the surface, because sometimes I know the medium I want to work with, and so if I know the medium I want to work with, I can already determine the surface that I want to work with. But there's other circumstances where I'm trying to figure out what surface I want to work with, because if I know the surface I want to work with, then that will determine the medium I want to work with. You get my drift? Okay, let me give you an example. For example, let's say, for instance, I want to work with watercolor paper. Then that already determines that I'm working with something that is watercolor, either watercolor paints, watercolor markers, or watercolor crayons, or watercolor liquid or pencils. See what I'm talking about? So now I'm trying to select the surface I want to work with. And thankfully for me, the way my art room is set up, I have direct link with my surface. It's not something I got to go day through or look up high or look up low. I look directly at my bookshelf and my surfaces are there. So I just basically look at them and try to determine the surface I want to work with. And I'm thinking for this challenge, I'm still between either markers or watercolor. I'm more going towards watercolor, so I'm thinking now that I want to use watercolor paper as a surface I want to work with. But like I said, selecting the surface is very, very key. You look at I look at the surface I currently have. I look at the watercolors papers I currently have. I look at the sketching or drawing paper I have. I look at the cardstock I have. I look at any conventional surface that I have, and that includes cereal boxes, because I like to use cereal boxes as surfaces. I look at all those and I consider how those surfaces will work with the mediums that I have. How will it work with my markers? How would it work with my watercolor paper? Although I did select watercolor paper as my surface I want to work with. Now I'm here thinking, how will the watercolor paints, markers, crayons, or pencils, or even watercolor liquids work with that watercolor paper that I have? I'm not going to go out there and buy something special for this challenge. I'm using the papers that I currently own to do this with. So now I'm here considering, how does it work with it? How does the paper tolerate it? How does the paper absorb it? How does the white of the paper reflect through that watercolor paper? I'm thinking about all these things. And that's why it's important for me that when I do these series, I try not to work with papers that I have not worked with yet, because in determining these things, I have to already have experience with. Now that I have selected the surface I want to work with, which is watercolor, I have to now determine the weight of that watercolor paper I want to work with, because I have two different two different weighting watercolor paper. Actually 3, but the third one I've never used. So I'm trying to stay away from that. I have a 90-pound weight watercolor paper. Well, actually it's 4. Okay, let's look at it. It has 90-pound weight watercolor paper. I have a 190-pound weight watercolor paper. I have a 140-pound weight watercolor paper, and I also have a 300-pound weight watercolor paper. So now I'm trying to determine what weighting paper I want to work with, and at the same time trying to determine the weight of the paper I want to work with, trying to determine how the mediums I have will work with those weights. The 90-pound weight watercolor paper that I have, it tends to absorb water very, very quickly, and it kind of tends to dull down the color a little bit. So I kind of already have that as a hint clue how to work with that paper. And the other ones that I have, the Derwent, which is the 190-pound weight watercolor paper, I learned how that tend to produce a greeny surfaces. And this is, I'm actually picturing when I render the picture, how those pictures are going to come out. I also look at the texture of that watercolor paper. Is it a rough texture? Is it a smooth texture? You know, I'm trying to determine, and how will those pictures look with that texture when I decided to draw those pictures and render them. The other things I'm trying to be concerned with is what the watercolor paper is made of. Am I going to be using wool pulp watercolor paper? Will I be using a mixture of cotton watercolor paper, or will I be using a 100% cotton watercolor paper for that? What kind of paper am I going to be using? What texture am I going to be using? What weight am I going to be using? Those things I consider in the beginning. That's even before I decide to make the sketchbook. Now that I have chosen the watercolor paper, now it's time for me to select the medium I want to use. Okay, so now that I've selected the paper I want to use, I want to go into the medium I'm going to be using. I have decided to use watercolor paint. How did I come to this conclusion, you're asking yourself? Well, it's rather very easy. After considering all the things that I've mentioned previously, I then consider all the watercolor mediums that I have. I have watercolor paints, I have watercolor pencils, I have watercolor liquid, I have watercolor tubes, I have watercolor crayons, but I want to use watercolor paints because I don't think that I've been painting enough. So I'm considering using watercolor paints for this series and for this challenge, get to know your OC and what I want to do. And then I'm going to consider, I think the last thing is going to consider what exact paint I'm going to use, but I'm going to be considering what the watercolor paints. And then I'll choose the watercolor paint I'm using, whether it's my Paul Rubens or Marie's or Stylex. I'm going to choose that in the last part of it after I make the sketchbook. But for right now, we are using watercolor paper and we're using watercolor paints. Now, join me next time for step 2, which is the second part to this, of doing the sketchbook.